every organisation has sacred cows. You know what sacred cows are? They are the traditions, the practices, the ways of doing things that no longer make sense. They're outdated, outmoded, and yet we so often cling to them even when they're well past their use-by date. A good example of a sacred cow I came across a few years ago was in the nursing profession. A number of years ago, nurses wore caps. In fact, they had for centuries. And the origins of the wearing of caps for nurses was actually rooted in tradition and religion. And the early nursing training colleges were actually run by the church in Germany and France. In the mid-1800s, when Florence Nightingale essentially formed the modern profession of nursing, she was training nurses to go to the front lines of the Crimean War. And so the cap became an integral part of a nurse's uniform because it actually held the hair back. It had a sanitary purpose. But in the years and the decades that followed, the nurse's cap became disconnected from that purpose. In fact, interestingly, it got to the point where by the 1960s and 1970s, nurses' caps were so small and often worn so high up on the head, they were not performing any sanitary function. Now, interestingly, in the late 80s and the early 1990s, nursing colleges and hospitals the world over started to phase out the nurse's cap in an effort to try and modernise the profession. And the outrage could have been heard far and wide. Nurses were just, it was an uproar. How dare you take our caps away? Because the nurse's cap, even though it served no sanitary function, had become a symbol of identity. The cap that I wore indicated where I'd done my training, for instance. And so what we saw is a symbol of tradition, a symbol of the past that no longer served a purpose, and yet people clung to it almost in an irrational way. And what you so often see in organisations is the same thing unfold. And it's important we actually understand, well, how does this happen? How do organisations get to the point where sacred cows form? What is the process by which a sacred cow comes to exist? So we can avoid falling into the trap of having these sacred cows, these outmoded traditions and practices that may well be holding us back and making us less relevant. Now, every sacred cow always begins life as an innovation. There's a problem that needs to be solved, a new way of doing things, a spark of creativity. And suddenly an innovation is implemented and it works. Now eventually others notice this innovation, this new way of doing things, and say, why don't we take that innovation that's working there and roll it out across the whole organisation, the whole business, the whole team. And suddenly that innovation becomes best practice. That's the second stage. So it goes from innovation to best practice. Now over time, and this is the key part, over time, best practice gets handed down to the next generation of employees and then the next generation and the next generation. But here's the challenge. We teach the next generation what to do and how to do things, but very rarely teach them why things are done that way. We very rarely share why the innovation was implemented in the first place. What's the problem it solved? All we do is hand on the way of doing things. Now you add time and suddenly that best practice becomes habitual process. People do it even though they don't know why they do it. It's just the way it's always been done. And you add more time and eventually habitual process becomes a sacred cow. And another good example of the power of a sacred cow in holding an organisation back. Many years ago, IBM used to have a songbook that when IBM conferences were held, every IBM employee would stand up and they'd sing from the songbook, almost as if they were in a traditional church. Now, a number of years ago, this was phased out as a tradition, but many IBMers found it a confronting thing to lose because it had been part of their identity, their sense of culture. Now, initially, that was probably an innovation. There was probably a time when someone said, hey, when we all get together as a company, let's sing songs, because in church and in the military, that's what we did to create that sense of camaraderie. So the innovation became best practice, then became habitual process, but became a sacred cow that became fixed, dated, outmoded. It was holding the organisation back. And so the challenge for any of us, regardless of what those sacred cows are, is how do we become mindful of the things we're doing that are no longer connected to purpose? Maybe an innovation for you has become a best practice. It's become even a habitual process. This is a point to step in and ask the question, why do we do things that way? The why question is the most important thing. Any practice, any tradition, any way of doing things that is no longer connected to a reason why, that there seems to be no purpose for, you need to honestly evaluate and say, is there a better, more modern, more effective way to do this? A failure to ask that question, just to habitually go through with the what and the how because it's the way we've always done things, it will set you on a collision course with irrelevance. Sacred cows always begin as innovations. It's all about the why in the beginning. The more we can keep focused on what that why is and only do things that solve problems, the more relevant, the more agile, the more vital we'll stay.